delighted to see I'm delighted to see so many of you here today to celebrate this book that has just been launched, Strangers to Neighbours. The Center for Refugee Studies is excited to participate in this launch because the topic, refugee resettlement, is one that is close to the hearts of many of the faculty and students and community members who are connected with CRS. I got my copy of the book in the mail just yesterday and took a really quick look. And you can see Center for Refugee Studies affiliates making several contributions to the text. So we're delighted to see that. Another reason why I'm excited that we're hosting this launch today is that today's moderator is also a co-editor of the text is Shauna Labman. Shauna is an associate professor at the University of Winnipeg's Global College. And as many of you know, she's one of the leading thinkers in Canada when it comes to refugee resettlement. And I'll just make a quick plug. She has another book, Crossing Law's Border, on the topic of refugee resettlement. And if you haven't had a chance to take a look at that book yet, I would encourage you to do so. So once again, welcome to this book launch, and I'm going to hand things over to Shauna.
Thank you, Sean, and hello, everybody. I'm sort of trying to scan the participants. There's a lot of familiar faces, and it's wonderful to see everyone. And it's great to be here, and it's great to have co-edited this book with my colleague, Geoffrey Cameron, mostly because while I do know a fair amount about refugee resettlement, there are so many aspects and questions, particularly when you dig into the depths of private sponsorship, that no one scholar, practitioner, advocate could really grasp all of it. And so the great thing about Strangers to Neighbours is that it brings so many different perspectives together. So more about that in a minute. I want to start by acknowledging where I'm coming to you from. So I am in my home, literally in my home, in my attic in Winnipeg, Manitoba. This is Treaty 1 territory. It's located on the lands of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Oji Cree, Dakota, and Dene people. And it's also the home of the Métis Nation. And I really think particularly when we have these talks and we're going to talk about welcoming newcomers to this land, it's really important to hold those treaty acknowledgements close, to really understand who we are as a nation, who are the original inhabitants of this land, and what it means to bring new people here. So Strangers to Neighbours, Refugee Sponsorship and Context was published by McGill Queen's University Press in 2020. I've got my copy here too, in their Refugee and Forced Migration Studies series. And as I said, the wonderful thing about editing this book is it brings all these different perspectives together. And some of you may have heard me talk about the book a little bit at the CRS talk I gave in November of 2020, also virtually in this way. But it's not that thick of a book, but it has 16 different chapters and a total of 31 authors who contributed to it. And those authors range from senior academics to graduate students from various disciplines, as well as sponsorship agreement holders, lawyers, and other refugee advocates. And we have representatives from all those groups with us, both speaking on the panel today, and also I see some other authors from the book in our participants in our audience here. One of the greatest challenges as an editor, and Geoffrey Cameron, who's here with me today, is the other co-editor of this book, was trying to decide the order of things, how to eventually put all these chapters into an order for the book. And we had a workshop with all our authors to sort of discuss what the major themes were. And ultimately, these chapters were put into 4 different parts of the book: context, case studies, challenges, and comparisons to what other countries are doing. But within those 4 broad themes, we also see all these other themes and intersections between chapters. And so in launching this book over a series of different virtual events over the course of the year, what Jeff and I wanted to do was really sort of zero in on some of those other important themes and aspects of the book that we wanted to talk about. And so today, what we thought was a really important consideration in the book and in some of the author's perspectives in the book is the role of religion in private sponsorship and the role of religious groups. And so we invited the chapter authors whose chapters don't necessarily focus on this question, but interact with this question in terms of their examinations. So what I'm going to do is in a minute, I'm going to ask each of the chapter authors that we've invited to the panel today to talk a little bit about themselves and present their chapter. And I've only given them 5 minutes each for that because I don't want this to be a sort of long presentation. I do enough of that in my classes and I know too many students sort of lose their attention. So rather than that, we're going to do an engaging dialogue. So I've posed them a number of questions and they've had these questions in advance to get thinking about. And we're going to have more of a discussion on these sort of key questions surrounding religious groups and religion and private sponsorship. And then once I've asked my questions and we've sort of pulled apart some of the issues, I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience to have all of you sort of ask your questions and pose those to the participants. And the final thing I will say, oh, Sean has just put something in the chat where you can get the book. That you're predicting what I'm going to say, Sean, because if you are interested in the book, if this sort of preliminary pitch has caught your attention, or you are looking as you listen for more information, you can order it from McGill Queen's University Press, and there is a discount that will run until April of this year. So you have a few more months for the discount, and the discount code is MQF2. So I'll put that in the chat in a minute when I'm not speaking. Okay, so with that, thank you, Sean. Sean's now put the discount code in the chat. With that, I'm going to turn to our panelists, and I'm going to start with my co-editor on the book, Geoffrey Cameron. Jeff and I really built this idea together out of discussion and debate and sometimes disagreement on how we understood private sponsorship. And it's been a really wonderful journey to produce this book with him. Jeff also has his own book coming out with McGill Queen's University Press. It's titled Send Them Here, Religion, Politics, and Refugee Resettlement in North America. And that's official release date is in February 2021. So Jeff has that on hand now too. Hopefully he flags it. There you go. Thanks, Jeff. And I encourage you to sort of dig deeper into his work with that afterwards. So Jeff, at this point, I'm going to hand the mic to you and ask you to spend about 5 minutes talking about your chapter and your work on refugee sponsorship in relation to religion.
Thanks a lot, Shauna, and thanks to Sean and Michelle for hosting this event at the Center for Refugee Studies, at least virtually. We're delighted to be to launch the book in affiliation with the center. So I was doing my PhD in refugee resettlement as a political science student at the University of Toronto when I was looking for other work on refugee resettlement. And as Sean has said, Shauna Labman has, established herself as a prominent expert on resettlement. And I was going to a lot of her work as I was researching for my own dissertation. And fortunately, we were able to come to know each other through a series of conferences where we discuss the kind of increasing prominence of private sponsorship and resettlement, especially as the Syrian program was getting underway. And it seemed to be call out for a new, or at least a first attempt to synthesize what is known about Canada's private refugee sponsorship program. And I think as also Canada began to talk about exporting its program, the demand for rigorous academic research on this became more clear. And there has been other work done on this. I know Refuge published a special issue on private sponsorship as well. And our hope is that the book is a contribution to knowledge that cuts across both academic work and practice. The purpose of my chapter in this book was, I guess, twofold. I mean, one purpose of the chapter was to push back the origins of private refugee sponsorship in Canada to the post-war period, and to do that explicitly. So much has been made of the Indo-Chinese program in the late 1970s and early 1980s as a landmark in the development of private refugee sponsorship. However, to understand why the program works the way that it does, I think the origins of that story go back much further. And so I begin my chapter with the challenge of displaced persons after the Second World War. And at the center of that story are religious groups and organized religious groups, specifically Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish groups in Canada. And the title of my chapter is Reluctant Partnership, a political history of private sponsorship in Canada from the 1940s to 1980. And the reason it's called Reluctant Partnership is that there's a kind of tentative relationship between these religious groups and the government agents, the bureaucrats who are responsible for often both policy development and implementation of a refugee resettlement program that went through kind of ebbs and flows in the post-war period. So right after the end of the Second World War, the Canadian government turned to organized religious groups to implement a family reunification policy it had developed as part of its response to the displaced persons challenge in Europe. This is a policy the government was unable to execute on its own, and it turned to religious groups to basically implement that policy. Once family reunification was complete, these same groups then kind of converted the program into sponsorship of co-religionists. So they began to sponsor those of their own faiths with whom they were connected in Europe. This program was then further expanded into what became known as the Approved Church Program in the 1950s. So what began as a kind of the government leaning on organized religious groups to implement a family reunification policy gradually expanded into a partnership between organized faith groups and the government to affect refugee resettlement during the early sort of Cold War period. And a number of early features developed during this time. For example, the idea of naming emerges very early on, that religious groups can identify who they want to sponsor to come to Canada. Also during this time, this feature of taking responsibility for the first year of settlement and care is also develops during this time as negotiations are undertaken between religious groups and the government about mutual responsibilities. So these early programs actually were very much unliked by the government. They saw that faith groups were bringing in often elderly or injured, disabled refugees who were not the kind of economically useful material that the government explicitly was searching for at the time. And so the program kind of broke apart in practice, even though it existed in policy throughout the 1960s. However, one of the groups that did remain active in private sponsorship during this time was the Canadian Jewish Congress, among a few other groups. And its advocacy, I think, as Shauna has shown, may have been quite important in kind of bringing private sponsorship into legislation in the 1970s, when the discussions are happening around the 1976, what would become the 1976 Immigration Act. And then when the 1976 Immigration Act comes to be implemented, it's the Mennonite Central Committee that is really comes to the table to negotiate the first master agreements, which then become replicated with dozens of other religious groups. So I could go into more detail, but I think really the scene I wanted to set with the first chapter was that first, the origins of refugee sponsorship go back further than the 70s, and that at various critical junctures along this path of development, you find organized religious groups in close conversation with the government, both about the shape of policy, but also about the nature of implementation. And when it comes to resettlement, implementation and policy development have kind of gone hand in hand and have really shaped what we come to know as private sponsorship today. So it's a program that has been, on the one hand, space has been provided by government, but has also rested a lot on the demand of religious groups themselves. So maybe I'll leave it there and allow others to speak. Thanks, Shauna.
Thank you, Jeff, for that wonderful introduction. And it leads very nicely into the next chapter of the book, which was written by our panelist, Sabine Lehr, but also Brian Dick, who I see in our participants. So a nod to Brian, welcome today. Sabine, do you want to introduce yourself and your chapter?
Sure, yeah. Thank you very much, Shauna, and thanks also to the CRS, Sean and Michelle, for inviting me to be on this panel. This is very exciting. I speak to you this morning from the city of Victoria on the West Coast. I'm located in my office, and so I would also like to acknowledge the territory I am on. This is traditional territory of the Lekwungen-speaking First Peoples, the Songhees, and the Esquimalt nations, where we do our work with immigrants and refugees. And I had also wanted to acknowledge Brian, who is the co-author on the chapter. And so, Brian, if I say anything you totally disagree with, or if you want to add something that you feel I have forgotten, please later on when we have the discussion, feel free to jump in. So our chapter is the third chapter in the book, and it is called Naming, in quotation marks, Refugees in the Canadian Private Sponsorship of Refugees Program, Diverse Intentions and Consequences. So we are picking up on this idea of naming that Geoffrey already mentioned. And it deals with this concept, which is foundational in the program. It's a foundational principle of the program. And it's really an informal term for sponsor referred, which is the more formal terminology. And that describes a feature of the Canadian sponsorship program that is still fairly unique in the world, even though there are now other community sponsorship programs emerging. So it is the ability of ordinary Canadians to refer to the Canadian government those refugees that they wish to sponsor. And as I said, even though there are other countries that are currently have started or are contemplating starting community sponsorship programs, this naming ability is still very special, because most other countries that have recently adopted such schemes rely on resettlement referrals from partner organizations, in particular, for the most part, the UN Refugee Agency. There are some others, but most of them rely on the UN Refugee Agency. And those referrals are then matched up with community sponsorship groups that don't know these persons, these refugees. So the reason why this naming or sponsor referral is important is because many resettled refugees, whether they come through private sponsorship or come through the government resettlement program, leave family members behind. And those family members are not necessarily those that qualify as family members under immigration legislation. So they can be, other relatives that are not covered and cannot be brought to Canada under other immigration streams. So they leave those behind in difficult situations. And so the community sponsorship program that we have here in Canada right now thus becomes an important avenue for newcomer families to reunite with their loved ones who are also refugees. That has also become known, you might hear this terminology of the echo effect. So this is also another kind of informal term that is being used. So in the chapter, Brian and I provide an overview of how naming became enshrined in the Canada Refugee Sponsorship Program. So like really building on the more comprehensive historical overview that Jeff is giving. We do outline in there the contestations that exist around the inclusion of this concept and highlight some of the intended and of the unintended consequences of naming refugees. We also try to explain how outcomes from naming that are observed in mature sponsorship programs, such as the Canadian one, may actually serve as design elements in these newer programs that are now emerging. So to illustrate that point a little bit, we provide the example of faster integration outcomes and more diversity in the resettlement population, which are both outcome indicators that have been observed here in Canada. And so as other countries look towards Canada in setting up sponsorship programs, there are initiatives, several of us have been and are still involved, in speaking with other countries that are developing such programs. So those countries may well wish to consider such outcome indicators in their own program design. In our chapter, we also discussed the complex relationship between naming and the other foundational principle of Canada's private sponsorship program, which is known as additionality. So what this means is that private or community sponsorship would lead to additional protection spaces for refugees over and above what the government provides. We show in our chapter how naming can both strengthen this additionality, but can also call its meaning into question when the number of privately sponsored refugees starts exceeding those refugees that are resettled by the government, as is the case in Canada right now. So ultimately, what we're saying in conclusion is that the question of whether to allow naming or not is important for countries to consider as they set up such programs. These countries must weigh the different objectives, such as the desire for providing humanitarian protection spaces for those that are most in need, with other objectives, such as family reunification for refugees, which of course in Canada is one of the objectives in the Immigration Refugee Protection Act. We end by saying that whichever route countries decide to take, the pressure for naming will become a reality for them. And that pressure is going to be exerted by the resettled refugees themselves, who over time will become a force that cannot be ignored. So in closing here with my introductory remarks, our chapter is one of those that doesn't explicitly address the connections with religion, as Shauna has mentioned in her intro, but you will see later on as we get into the questions that there is a nexus between the kinds of things we're talking about in our chapter and religion and faith communities. So I'll keep you in suspense for later on around that. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabine. So both Jeff and Sabine and Brian's chapters come from the first part of the book, the context part of the book. And the rest of our panelists today are coming from the case studies. So we're going to dig now into some of the chapters that show the real work of sponsorship groups and how that sort of plays into how sponsorship is understood. So our next chapter that we're discussing has 3 authors with us today. And so I'm going to leave it up to them to decide how they're going to present their chapter and themselves. But I'd invite Kaylee, Luann, and Thea to come together and speak to your chapter in the book on the Mennonite Central Committee. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Shauna. I'll start us off. In our chapter, Thea, Kaylee, and I report on a qualitative case study. And this case study was part of a larger SSHRC grant in which I'm using secondary quantitative analysis of Stats Canada data sets to develop indicators to measure dynamics of social exclusion and inclusion, specifically for immigrants and refugees and racialized individuals in Canada. So this qualitative study with Mennonite Central Committee, MCC, was designed to complement that analysis to inform our conceptual models of social exclusion and inclusion. So we were interested in exploring whether and in what ways refugee sponsorship is a model for social inclusion, and also how dynamics of social exclusion might be reproduced in these relationships. An additional objective of our study was to understand the unique features that have motivated, anchored, and sustained refugee sponsorship among longstanding sponsoring groups, especially those working with MCC. So Kaylee and Thea will tell you a bit more about our study. I hand it over to Kaylee.
Thanks, Luann. Hello, everyone. Nice to see some of you and see some familiar names in the list here. So yeah, great to be here. And so I work with Mennonite Central Committee in Ontario. MCC is an international relief development and peace building organization that's working in over 57 countries around the world. We just celebrated our 100th anniversary in 2019. And our work with refugees in Canada is primarily as a national sponsorship agreement holder that operates across 5 provinces. And as has been mentioned, we've been a SOF for about just over 40 years from the beginning. And so I work for MCC Ontario. I'm based in Waterloo, Ontario. I'm one member of a large team that I'm honored to get to be a part of. And Brian Dick, who is here today, is our National Migration and Resettlement Coordinator, and he also informed this chapter. So as a practitioner, I loved the opportunity to get to partner with Luann and with Thea on this research. It was an opportunity to step back and to reflect on the work that we do, to go deeper in understanding MCC's history of sponsorship, the motivations and dynamics that exist within the sponsorship relationships. So I'll share a little bit about the scope of our research, who we talked to, and then I'll pass it over to Thea. So this chapter was informed by community-based research. We ran 7 focus groups in the province of Ontario, specifically geographically the cities of the Greater Toronto Area, Waterloo, Niagara region, Stratford, and Leamington. So captured a mix of urban and rural resettlement experiences. In total, there were 49 participants accounting for 21 different churches. We also ran 7 interviews with 15 former refugee newcomers who were sponsored by these groups. And as I mentioned, Brian informed this chapter as well as a review of some internal documents on MCC's practice and history. Over to you, Thea.
Thanks, Kaylee. And apologies, my computer decided for the first time ever to just spontaneously black out. So fingers crossed that it doesn't decide to do that again. Yeah, I'm Thea Enns. I completed my graduate work in refugee and migration studies and was hired as an independent researcher to work with Luann and Kaylee on this paper. And thank you again for having me. It's always exciting to revisit this work and have a discussion about it. So as Kaylee explained a bit about MCC as an organization, and so there are a number of factors that made us interested in studying MCC's refugee sponsorship program. For one, its history as a part of the original negotiations in 1979, as Jeff talked about quickly, is an important aspect to why it'd be interesting to see how their role in refugee resettlement has continued onwards. This is 40 years since it began, as well as it being one of the largest sponsorship agreement holders in Canada. Because of this long time engagement with the program, many of its churches, which are its constituent groups, have been sponsoring for over 40 years. We sometimes call them serial sponsors. And when speaking to these churches, a number of them spoke with the language of, them having the culture of sponsorship, that it's just simply something they did year after year. Another unique feature that we wanted to explore is the fact that MCC is committed to the majority of its cases being what are blended visa office referred, or BVOR. So this would be, sometimes we call them sponsor the stranger type cases. So the sponsor doesn't know the individual that would be coming to Canada. And in 2017, 1/3 of all of these cases were sponsored by MCC. So with all of this in mind, what did we learn from MCC's refugee program that may be important for sustaining refugee sponsorship programs? So I'll quickly highlight a few of the things that we identify in our chapter and hopefully can explore a bit more in this talk. So for one, we found that the role that MCC plays as a SAW is quite significant. So unlike many SAWs, MCC has paid staff, such as Kaylee, that help to run the program. They're a well-respected resettlement partner. The government and UNHCR engages on quite a high level with them. They sit on various national councils and participate in multilateral discussions and international forums. So this in turn plays a role in supporting its constituent groups, as well as attracting new sponsors to partner with them. Secondly, we note in the chapter that MCC reflects and feeds into a shared refugee history. So many Mennonites actually share a refugee history and in turn identity that notably dates back to the 1920s, when around 21,000 Mennonites came to Canada to escape the Soviet Union. So for many Mennonites in Canada, whether they're claiming a religious affiliation or not, sponsorship through MCC is giving an expression to their past refugee experience, their current privileged position as settled Canadians, and this sort of sustained collective identity that they have with one another. And third is that MCC sort of creates these synergies at a local and global level. And these are interpersonal, these are institutional, and they connect and take place over space and time. And this sounds maybe weird at first, but it's actually quite simple when it's broken down. So for one, the structure of MCC creates these local links through the direct engagement with the churches that it works with, and in turn, the individual congregation members. Internationally, MCC is connected with Mennonite churches around the world. And as Kaylee mentioned, there are programs all over in 50 countries with 1,000 workers globally. And then as I saw, these synergies play a pivotal role in creating a culture of sponsorship through strengthening and motivating and supporting these groups into this sort of global peace building project. So to sort of sum up what we learned, we sort of see that the refugee program shows how the public-private sponsorship agreement can effectively function to sustain sponsorship. We recognize the role that the SAW plays in supporting groups, but also recognize the role that religious and cultural values, history, and organizational structures can play in motivating sponsors. And of course, if you want more of the details, it's all there in the chapter. Thanks.
Thank you to Thea and Kaylee and Luann. That was a very well-organized presentation between the three of you on one chapter. Well done. Our final panelist today, who is talking about her chapter, is Madison Pearlman. And I maybe a little bit strong-armed Maddie into writing this chapter while she was not busy at all articling after graduating from law school. But the nice thing about Operation Ezra is, which she will talk about, puts a nice contrast to the Mennonite Central Committee and the different ways that sponsorship by sponsorship agreement holders can operate. So Maddie, with that, I'm going to hand it to you.
Thank you, and I'm really excited to be here and to be part of this panel. I had this sort of feeling that I'm having right now. I had it when we all met together as all the authors of the book, and through communications with the authors, and now that I get to go last of the authors here today and to listen to the sort of my co-authors speak. I'm like, oh, that theme is really relevant, and that idea played into my chapter too. And so I think it's really incredible to see a lot of these sort of common themes that are interwoven and within a lot of the chapters of this book, and certainly sort of within each individual chapter. So as Shauna mentioned, my chapter is on Operation Ezra. I'm currently a lawyer in Toronto, but I'm originally from Winnipeg, and Operation Ezra is this, what I have found to be this sort of incredible, I call it in the chapter a coalition of various different groups, individuals, organizations that came together to privately sponsor Yazidi refugees to Winnipeg. And so I first heard about the project kind of through the grapevines, and I became very interested in for the work that they were doing. Operation Ezra really came together in 2015 as a result of the genocide in Iran against Iraq against the Yazidis. And as others have talked about today, there's sort of this shared history of refugeehood and persecution that I think really brought together these two communities, be it the Jewish community in Winnipeg and the small but now quite large Yazidi population community in Winnipeg.
This letter, in order to submit this letter, you have to come back and see me because I have another meeting.
Here we go, sort of to come together. And so I explore sort of this idea, and we'll talk more about sort of these religious groups having a history of sponsorship, but also having some certain histories themselves motivating these groups to engage in sponsorship. And the case study that the chapter really focuses on is this sort of grassroots group and grassroots initiative that has grown and grown and grown. And I was particularly interested in sort of this idea of grassroots mobilization to sponsor refugees, but also to change some of the narratives, both on a very sort of local level, but also on a national and international scale. And as at the end, Kaylee already mentioned, you have these private sponsorship groups who also can influence government, and we saw that with Operation Ezra, where they started as just a couple of families, and in this real response to crisis, but then we've seen over the last number of years this group develop and grow into what I call in the chapter sort of a quasi-governmental entity, where the group is not only engaging in private sponsorship and bringing families to Canada, but they're also providing support once families arrive. They're also providing English as a second language supports, community events and gatherings to bring people together. And I also explore in my chapter some of the other impacts of communities coming together, and I know we'll get to that in the discussion, talking about it sort of as an interfaith tool, which is exactly what happened in the case of Operation Ezra, which really brought sort of two very different communities and groups together with some very sort of shared or similar experiences, and it really served to break down barriers and to break down misconceptions. So sort of the power and the impact of private sponsorship and groups such as Operation Ezra is really important, I think, to explore and to sort of situate it both in the local as well as the national and global scenarios.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, so with that sort of intro to each of the chapters here, and again, these are just 4 of 15 chapters in the book, so you're seeing some of the pieces here. But what I want to delve into, given our topic today, is really I want to start by asking the panelists to give some nuance to our understanding of how religion and religious groups support refugee sponsorship. So we've mentioned some different religious groups, but what is meant by religion in terms of its relation to refugee sponsorship? And Thea, I'm going to point to you first to see if you want to start us off on this.
Great, thanks, Shauna. So I think first it's important to sort of nuance a bit what we're talking about when we talk about religion or faith. So not in the broader sense that it's not so much just about belief, but we can talk about culture, we can talk about practice, we can talk about identity and how that manifests on an individual level or a congregational or institutional level. In our chapter, some of the examples that we provide to sort of illustrate this nuance is, so for instance, on an individual level, we spoke to some individuals who identify as Mennonite, and one might identify from very much a faith perspective of Christian values and whatnot, and another might identify Mennonite more in a cultural and ancestral sense, in that, well, my family came over during the 1920s, and it's sort of this cultural identification. On a congregational level, when we talk about religion and the role religion plays, well, for sponsorship, the actual structure of a church is really fundamental to sustaining potentially a very positive sponsorship sort of ecosystem, because you have this sort of ready-made group of people that share common values, that share experiences with sponsorship, and kind of can pass on the baton like year after year, and you have this pool of money that's raised. So that's one way of also sort of looking at religion from that congregational level. And on an even larger institutional level, MCC as a Christian organization and institution, and how it's sort of the active arm of the church, sometimes referred to as this. It provides this tool to act out faith and values in this very large and institutional way. So those are sort of some ways that we nuance that in our chapter, and I would be interested to see also from other people how they interpret that nuanced view.
Thank you. That's a great start. Maddie, I'm going to point to you to sort of see how your chapter aligns or your views.
Absolutely. And I think what Thea mentioned in terms of sort of religion as faith and as culture, I sort of picked up on the fact that it was sort of this combination of both that really motivated sort of an existing religious group to sort of come together and to consider ways to help. And I think that that was really strengthened by, as I already sort of mentioned, this shared history of, again, persecution and refugeehood that the Jewish community, from the interviews that I conducted with some of the founders of Operation Ezra, it was the stories that were being told about the Yazidi groups and their suffering that really spoke to members of the Jewish community and motivated them to come together. So I think that can be that sort of shared history, and that shared history sort of being different amongst different religious groups as being a motivating or a driving force behind getting involved. I think in the context of, again, sort of the history or religious as well as cultural values that have developed within various religious groups, often there's this common discussion around a duty and a duty to help and a duty to sort of address some of the sufferings that they may see from your own history. And that was something that the people that I interviewed for the chapter raised. And the other thing I would just say on that is, I think, religion can, in a lot of ways, it's a source of sort of bringing people together. And in this case of Operation Ezra, there sort of were two different religions, two different cultures, and it was some of those shared experiences that really was a way to bring these groups together, both in the short term, but also long term, because you're seeing these community connections continue and become stronger as the communities grow.
Thank you. Kaylee, you've raised your hand. Do you want to add something here?
Sure, yeah. I think as we think about religion too, and the nuances of religion, reflecting that even within one denomination, there can be a very wide spectrum of understanding, of expression, of a particular emphasis on a specific theological point. And so as I reflect on MCC and the work that we do, what is beautiful about what we do, but also very challenging, is just the wide spectrum that exists within the Mennonite denomination, from very, very conservative to very, very liberal. And MCC, as the service arm of the Mennonite Church, gets to bring everybody together in the name of service under this very large tent. And so just wanted to add the nuance that even though you can work with one particular denomination, there's still a lot of diversity that exists within that.
Yeah, excellent point. I'm going to shift, because I'm conscious of time, a little bit to the second question, which builds on this first question. And it's really, has the role of religion shifted over the 40 plus years of the program? So when we're looking at the discussion right now, does this look different than how it started? And Jeff, you pointed to this a little bit at the beginning of your presentation. So I'm going to turn it back to you now to elaborate a little bit more.
Yeah, thanks, Shauna. I think the previous remarks have sort of foreshadowed some of the things I'm going to say. I mean, my answer is both yes and no. I mean, it's the role of religion has changed, yes, in the sense that, as I mentioned, the initial involvement of many religious groups in the work of sponsorship, or what was, early on in the sponsorship program when it was still kind of embryonic, was really to help their own, or at least at first to help family members to find their loved ones in Europe, and then later to help their own fellow Lutherans, fellow Jews, fellow Mennonites, fellow Catholics, to bring them to Canada at a time when there were really no obvious solutions for the situation of displaced people in Europe after the war. But over time, I think we've seen, even by the mid 50s to 60s, and then this became much more clear in the 70s and 80s, these self-religion as a kind of social force of self-help kind of evolved into a more sort of universal expression of solidarity. You know, interfaith collaboration has been, you know, a feature of the program since before the 76 Immigration Act. So even some of the experiences Madison and Thea are describing are not so new to the program, that the interfaith collaboration has been an early feature, especially at the level of advocacy and the role that religious groups have played as a kind of political force in the program. But also, I mean, so yes, there's been a kind of movement from sort of self-help to more general universal solidarity, but there are also certain constants in the program. And one I think is very important that Thea mentioned, which is the institutional structure of religious communities has been really essential from the early part of the program. I mean, the transnational connections that faith groups had in even the 1940s was essential to their ability to reunite family members, as well as kind of a sense of belonging that transcended the nation state. So the institutional structures that embodied this broader transnational universal sensibility is incredibly important, as well as I think an underlying moral sensibility, moral commitment that finds its roots in theology. I think has also been essential and remains essential to at least at a grassroots level, as well as at an institutional level, and many of those involved in sponsorship.
Thank you, Jeff. Does anyone else from the panel want to elaborate on this? Are there other thoughts to contribute, or should we move? Kaylee?
I can jump in, sure, thanks. Can speak to the role of religion in MCC's program and how it's shifted over the past 40 years. And to start by saying I'm by no means an expert in MCC history, but we'll share some of what our research and chapter highlights. So MCC is a faith-based Christian organization whose staff in Canada are Christian, who we partner with and who we serve are diverse in religious and ethnocultural representation. And MCC does not prioritize external partnerships, nor the refugees we resettle based on religion. MCC has an understanding that it isn't our role to shape Mennonite theology. Instead, we are to be, as Thea has mentioned previously, the service arm of the Mennonite Church. But I think we also know that service work can impact the evolution of theology. So there is this kind of cyclical relationship that exists there. This emphasis that MCC takes on action allows for non-theological and non-religious identification. So not all of the sponsors we work with ground their engagement in religious duty. It is really the core Mennonite constituency who has sustained this program over the past 40 years. There have been surge moments over the years that have diversified the pool of sponsors that MCC has worked with, but those who have faithfully engaged consistently are the core Mennonite constituency churches. And this continues to be true today. For these churches, sponsorship aligns with their faith. Some of the key tenets of Anabaptist and Mennonite culture include living out your faith in action through an intentional lifestyle, nonviolent resistance, a commitment to the biblical call to love mercy, to act justly, an emphasis on pacifism and community and mutuality. I can speak a little bit from my experience too. In 2015 and 2016, MCC in Ontario, our program grew significantly. Prior to 2015, MCC in Ontario worked with 8 to 10 sponsorship groups to resettle between 40 to 60 newcomers a year. And we grew to work with over 200 sponsorship groups and resettled over 1,000 refugee newcomers between 2015 and 2016. And half of these 200 or so sponsors were first-time sponsors who had not partnered with MCC before and did not have a specific religious or faith affiliation. And so MCC intentionally made the decision to say yes to working with groups outside of the Mennonite constituency and have continued to do so. I think as we think about the evolution of religion and who MCC's core constituency congregations are, and I think Sabine is going to speak to this later, is that they are aging and they're shrinking in size. And so the leaders who have mobilized these efforts within many of these churches are getting older. And so the question of sustainability is a critical one that MCC is processing. As a new and younger group begins to take the place of an aging demographic of Mennonites, questioning how do we go deeper in understanding what this new generation needs to engage. So that's part of what we're questioning. I think also the question of, as we reach out intentionally across difference, what are the values and approaches in the way that MCC has operated that need to be articulated more clearly? What are the elements of what you take for granted as common knowledge or common understanding or a common approach when you're working within and amongst your own? And so a question for MCC that we're processing is, how do we keep these values alive? How do we pass on important traditions, especially as we partner across difference and engage a new generation of Mennonites? I'll stop there.
That raises a lot of more questions and ideas, and it sort of points towards the next question that we wanted to address today, which is how sponsorship fosters these interfaith connections. And some of you have pointed to that a little bit already, but Sabine, I think maybe this time I'll start with you if you want to sort of give some perspective on this to get us rolling.
Sure. Thank you, Shauna. So yeah, as I said, we are in our chapter, Brian and I, not particularly coming from the religious faith-based, lens on the issue of naming. We're coming very much from that naming perspective. So I want to talk a little bit about how faith communities act as intermediaries in that sponsorship space and what that means for the interfaith relationships. Many of the faith communities, particularly these original traditional communities like the MCC, like Catholic sponsors, the Anglicans, like these what I call the early adopters of refugee sponsorship from an organizational perspective, they don't necessarily know refugees themselves. So we need to talk a little bit about how this actually works in practice, this naming issue. So these faith communities are being approached by people in Canada who are relatives of the refugees overseas. And it's in that way that they become intermediaries in that space. Of course, there are ways in which the Canadian relative could name their relatives overseas directly to the Canadian government for sponsorship. There is an avenue for that. Some of you might be familiar with the Group of 5 sponsorships where this is possible, but there's many obstacles to sponsoring in that category. So there's sometimes just not the level of knowledge to work through this very complex process. But from a legal perspective, there is a barrier in place that the refugees that are overseas need to have a refugee status determination document from the UNHCR or the government where they are located. And so that acts as a barrier. And this is why they approach faith communities. So the faith communities find themselves sort of in this dual role between the sponsor, the stranger, because they might not know the refugees themselves, often don't, but facilitating at the same time this family linkage with the person that's approaching them. I should also say, I know there's a question in the chat about, what's sort of the relationship, what's the percentage between, the sponsor, the stranger, where there's no relation with the refugee to the ones, that are family reunification. I should say these are not ideal types. They occur on a spectrum, and that's really important, to understand because they might be, they might know someone as a friend, they might not be a relative. The people that are being referred by the UN through that blended visa office referred program that was mentioned, that generally count as the sponsor, the stranger, might actually have a relative in Canada. So it's blurry and it's a messy space. So I just wanted to say that, and we can talk more about it later. So what's I think important is that sometimes the referring person in Canada shares the same faith as the faith community that this person approaches, but frequently they do not. And so these situations are then the ones that result in these interfaith learning opportunities, where refugee sponsorship, because it extends over multiple years, because the process is often very lengthy. And so there's lots of opportunity for mutual learning and understanding. In the pre-arrival period, obviously, it's frequent contact between that referring person and that faith community that is helping, that has agreed to take on the sponsorship, but also then often now we have, wonderful platforms where faith communities that are acting as sponsors can interact directly with the refugees overseas that might be of a very different faith. And so they're slowly and carefully, starting to understand one another and preparing sort of the ground for when that refugee actually arrives in Canada. And then, of course, during that 1 year period after arrival, there's very, very intense interaction between these people, so the faith community and the refugee. So really, what I want to highlight is the role of these faith communities as intermediary actors, that also, if there's different faith backgrounds involved or no faith, there's also that possibility that then these interfaith connections are created.
Thank you. I know both Maddie and Kaylee have some ideas to contribute to this. So maybe Kaylee and then Maddie.
Great, thanks, Shauna. And thanks, Sabina. Yeah, I think a few thoughts here. MCC is intentional about interfaith connections at all levels of work internationally and here in Canada. As Thea previously mentioned, there was a review conducted of MCC sponsorship program in 2008. And what came out of that review was a commitment to have, as best as we can, 60% of our caseload referred by UNHCR or Canadian visa office cases, so as to prioritize those who have been identified as the most vulnerable. And so the mainstream through which 60% of this caseload across the country now comes through is through this blended visa office referred program, BVOR for short. And so these cases are predominantly, quote unquote, sponsor the stranger, where the sponsors have not previously met the newcomers, where we don't know the newcomers' religion beforehand. And so often they are interfaith relationships that are built. I think a part of how MCC has always seen this program is that we've always seen it as a long-term peace building initiative in Canada. And I think the critical role that, as Sabina was saying, that the sponsorship agreement holder plays in training, in equipping, in preparing sponsors to engage in these relationships in a healthy way is really important. And this chapter also talks about the concept of mutual transformation, relationship building as peace building. These are core tenets of how MCC operationalizes this work and the values that ground how we inform the training that we do for our sponsors. It was interesting, we pulled out in the midst of doing this research a document from 1979 where at the time one of the sponsor facilitators from MCC had written to sponsors, and I'll read the excerpt. It talks about the role of the sponsor, and it says, "Your role then is not to provide instant answers, but rather to encourage the newcomers to weigh and test a variety of possibilities. With your guidance, they will grow in confidence as they adapt to new routines and develop their own solutions to the many problems that will confront them. Sponsors should be involved in a mutual learning process, just as a very important part of your effort is introducing and explaining the Canadian way of life. You have much to learn as well from the newcomers." So it was cool to see that those are values that have been carried through since 1979 until today.
Yeah, that's fascinating actually to hear that. Thank you. Maddie?
Thanks, Shauna. So just a couple points that I wanted to add, just in terms of the discussion about naming, Operation Ezra. sort of took on that intermediary role in a sense, whereby, you know, the initiative was very much spearheaded by this existing Jewish community, but it was members of the Yazidi community already in Winnipeg who were, you know, coming to these members of the Jewish community to say, look, you know, there's a lot of people in need. We know it, you know, it's our families, it's, you know, friends and acquaintances and families of families. You know, we're getting, you know, hundreds of requests a day. And so there was a sense of this intermediary where they were sponsoring, somewhat sponsoring strangers, but on the other hand, it also had an element of sort of that family link sponsorship, whereby those that were being sponsored did have a personal connection to people already in Winnipeg. And, you know, aside from the legal requirements, as Sabine already mentioned, Operation Ezra developed a framework for naming and sort of drew on sort of these objective and somewhat subjective elements. So looking at size of the family, age of the family members, specific needs. Many of the Yazidi refugees that have come have been particularly high needs, a high needs population based on their experiences. And this framework also took into account geographic location. And so I break that down a bit in the chapter. And there's certainly there's been some criticism as I discuss in the chapter, but it's sort of this unique example from a naming perspective. And the other piece that I wanted to mention is I refer to Operation Ezra often as this coalition, and what I think makes Operation Ezra work in the way that it has is it was a coalition. So it was started, yes, by existing communities, but I mean, they had, and they still have this long list of partners from all different backgrounds and many different faiths, and in fact, worked with MCC. They've worked with other churches who have had, a long history of sponsorship and working with newcomers. So from a very practical sense, but also from sort of a knowledge sharing and knowledge building sort of purpose, Operation Ezra, really valued and I think sought out these different groups, and what the impact of that or the outcome of that is really sort of this web of different connections with different faith-based groups, but also just different communities more generally, coming from a variety of socioeconomic, education, business backgrounds, that I think sort of creates this really rich and multidimensional coalition.
Okay, that's great. I'm seeing lots of questions start happening in the chat. So I want to shift us to our final sort of main question, and then we're going to go into the chat. And some of these questions are going to evolve. When we were writing this book, when we were coming together to discuss it, Jeff mentioned at the beginning that this started sort of our conversation started in 2015, 2016. Sponsorship was surging, Canadian attention to it from both the government and individual Canadians was very high. Numbers grew very significantly over a period of time. And now for the past year, we've been in a very different reality of very closed borders, limited access, health restrictions, and the realities of the pandemic. And so I want to spend our sort of final moments before we turn to questions with some comments on how sponsorship is operating now. UNHCR released their statistics on 2020 the other day. And in terms of UNHCR referred refugees to Canada, only about 3,500 came in 2020, which is very low. So how sponsorship is operating during the pandemic and these closed and restricted borders, and how does sponsorship, particularly that led by these religious groups, move forward in the future once we get past this pandemic moment that we are in for longer than we all expected. So Jeff, we haven't heard from you for a while, so I'm going to start with you on this point. If there's any historical precedent to this moment or other sort of starting observations.
Yeah, thanks, Shauna. I mean, it's hard to think of an historical precedent, isn't it, right now? But I think if there's something to be learned from history, is that there can be very quick changes to resettlement. I mean, Shauna, as you've written, and I think as many people are aware, resettlement is very much at the political discretion of the government. And so, we certainly have seen that in the United States, during the heyday of the Syrian program. Even the United States, increased its admissions significantly towards the end of the Obama administration to upwards of 100,000 a year. And under the previous president, it was, around 10 or 15,000 a year, if that. So we can see how political circumstance can really change the commitments that governments will make, including the Canadian government, to resettlement. And we've seen in Canada as that humanitarian commitments can increase when there's public pressure and when public attention focuses, and then it can also, it can dip down when that attention is dissipated and moves elsewhere. So I think that's something to be conscious of. I think, and we have seen historically that the religious groups that have been involved in resettlement, who have the kind of institutional memory, institutional structure, have played an important countervailing role in the context of governments that want to reduce resettlement numbers. I mean, that's been something that has been a feature of this program over time, both in terms of the overall numbers as well as in the selection of refugees along criteria of vulnerability rather than, for example, economic utility, which was a significant feature of the discourse around resettlement in the 50s and 60s, where you had the government really wanting to select people for professions in need in Canada, and religious groups often making a humanitarian case. So there's a role to be played by organized civil society, and especially religious groups, I think, in maintaining the kind of demand side for refugee resettlement through private sponsorship. I mean, there are positive signs. I mean, as a number of people on this call will know, the new immigration levels plan that was released in October last year, after the pandemic had been underway for a while, has maintained, at least projected to maintain, a significant Canadian commitment to resettlement, albeit one that expects private sponsors to do a great deal of heavy lifting. And I mean, others on this panel can speak more to this than I can, but many of these sponsorship groups are charitable organizations that I think have been probably hit pretty hard by the pandemic and by its implications for their capacity to fundraise. So I think that's also something to pay attention to, is whether sponsorship agreement holder groups that rely on voluntary giving will be able to maintain the same level of activity.
Thank you, Jeff. Sabina, can I point to you now to talk about some of the challenges you're experiencing?
Sure, yeah. And I've also kept an eye on the chat, so I think I will be able to kind of respond to some of those questions. So as Kaylee has already indicated, and Jeff also just said it, obviously the challenges are not, only related to the pandemic. I mean, the pandemic has brought some of the challenges into sharper focus, but questions around the sustainability of the program with these ever-rising numbers of immigration targets to be brought in through the private sponsorship program with the help of volunteers, or entirely pretty much carried by volunteers, started before the pandemic started. The demographics, the challenges in the faith communities, in the traditional, the early adopter faith communities. So basically, by and large, those of some Christian denomination, and the aging demographic there. So we've been talking about that before the pandemic. And so I think, as I said, it's brought things into sharper focus now that we have this other layer of complexity because we have so many people that are over 60, 70 that are undertaking sponsorships. These are also the people that are at higher risk from COVID-19. And so some sponsors have had to reconsider their ability to actually be involved in sponsorship. Like Jeff has said, some of these organizations that are all nonprofit societies have been very adversely impacted financially because they don't have the same level of donations that they had pre-pandemic. And that's, of course, makes it more difficult to engage in refugee sponsorship, which requires a significant amount of fundraising as the government increasingly, has certain standards around also on the financial side, what needs to be fundraised. So, but I would say that at the same time, I don't see the picture as being that bleak. At the same time, we see continued and rising interest in refugee sponsorship from newcomer communities who become organized, and they make up a significant portion of the new sponsorship agreement holders that are now applying for that status. And some of those are linked to particular faith communities, which are different, from the early adopter faith communities. So I personally think that the sustainability of refugee sponsorship can be ensured into the future, but I do believe that we will see a shift from the traditional actors to a new type of actor, and in particular the immigrant communities that will further expand their share of the sponsorship landscape. They may or may not be related to particular faith traditions, but we know that there is a good percentage that are. So I think we are going to see a shift moving forward.
Thank you. So my last sort of question on this to Maddie, Thea, and Kaylee, but Thea, we haven't heard from you in a while, so I'm going to start with you if that's okay. What are the strengths of the religious groups in coming beyond COVID? Where is there sort of the real particular power of these religious groups? MCC, Maddie, you can talk about Operation Ezra and the Jewish community, but what do you see as the particular strengths moving forward?
Thanks, Shauna. I think a number of the strengths, and this question I was thinking about myself as well, is because when you think about what the strengths are, it's also what can we learn that would apply in different perhaps non-religious settings as well. I think this idea of these shared values and that bring people together and sort of you're rooted in shared values and shared understanding that drive your actions. Because I think when you think about Syria, there was this call to action that appealed to so many different groups, regardless of faith, because there was something motivating them that was attached to some value of helping, and in that sense, more of a general humanitarian way. But I think for a lot of religious groups, they're consistently rooted in shared values that will consistently drive them to want to help, to want to engage, regardless of the context that change and world events that change. So I guess so to answer your question, I think that is one of the key aspects, is this consistent groundedness in a shared common value and motivation. If I explained that well enough and not too convoluted there.
Maddie, Kaylee, anything to add there?
I can jump in and say that that's exactly what I would have said, and sort of looking at it through the lens of Operation Ezra, it was those common values. I think, that element of humanitarianism that brought people together but keeps people together, and I think will keep groups together moving forward. One of the things Thea just mentioned was, can we sort of think about lessons learned? And in the book, I wanted to sort of think about, okay, this coalition has had such success locally, but can that be repeated elsewhere, as Shauna mentioned just before. And, I think the idea of having an existing community and some of those existing connections is something to take note of. And I think within a lot of religious groups and thinking about their sponsorship efforts, that existing those existing roots, I think certainly help create a strong foundation and create a sustainability. Again, specifically in the context of Operation Ezra, they were and are a bit unique in that they're a new effort and a new initiative, only starting in 2015. Yes, ad hoc sponsorships were certainly taking place, but starting in just 2015, they're pretty new to the program, and reflecting on sort of the mobilization sort of impact that they've had in terms of mobilizing government. Like we just talked about a few minutes ago, they were able to mobilize and negotiate and influence key political actors in bringing more Yazidi refugees to Winnipeg and to Canada more broadly. But what I think sort of the power of some of the interfaith dynamics of religious groups and private sponsorship is, at least in the context of Operation Ezra, as you're seeing new families that have only come to Canada 1 to 2 years ago, they're very involved in the sponsorship and in the resettlement aspect of sponsorship to this day. So you have a lot of these families volunteering, making those familiar connections. Many of the youth in both communities have come together, and so there is this sort of new generation that is willing to be a part of sponsorship efforts and resettlement efforts once families arrive. That I think, on a hopeful note, will hopefully increase the sustainability of these efforts.
Kaylee, anything to add? Or
Sure. I think faith communities influence public opinion in the midst of fear and uncertainty, and have a powerful role to play in shaping how people think about this need and respond to it in the midst of this time. And when they come together within their networks, can impact public opinion. I think that something that hasn't been mentioned yet is the Global Refugee Sponsorship Initiative. And it's interesting to see that, as we heard from Jeff, the historical roots of how this work started in Canada was birthed by faith-based organizations. And we're seeing internationally through the Global Refugee Sponsorship Initiative that those who are stepping up to start this in their own ways within their own country contexts are also predominantly faith-based organizations. So it's interesting to see that play out on the international scale. And I think lastly, faith-based leaders and institutions hold wisdom, historical knowledge, and can act as mentors, teachers, motivators. So as we have new generations of sponsors as SAWs coming in, the traditional actors aging, how can we create opportunities to connect mentors and connect these two groups together?
okay, that's wonderful. Thank you. I have pages upon pages of notes that the panelists have sent me that we haven't gotten to at this point, but I'm conscious of the fact that we are at 10 minutes left. And I did promise our audience that they would have a time to post some more questions. Some of those, I commend our panelists for trying to weave those questions in, but I'm going to open it again for questions. I'll just also acknowledge, I haven't been asking questions to Luann. That's because she deferred to Thea and Kaylee to represent their chapter, but she's also open to answering questions in this very now brief 9-minute Q&A. So if anyone wants to jump in with a question or put it in the chat, we can open that to more, or I can just let the panelists each have final thoughts if we have managed to answer all your questions, which I highly doubt. I don't know if people are madly typing or if everyone's just quiet at this point. This is what happens in all my classes every day. I'm very used to this awkward silence. Okay, So what if we don't have more questions? What I'll do to sort of complete the discussion here is ask each of the panelists to provide some final thoughts on if they've noticed a question in the chat that I wasn't able to pull out and that someone else hasn't, or other aspects related to the role of religion in sponsorship that can leave our audience with some sense of the program and moving forward from this moment of COVID and the pandemic. So I'm going to let you all jump in. Luann, you haven't had a chance to speak. Is there anything you'd like to say and add to our conversation?
One thing that comes to mind is picking up a bit on what Kaylee just mentioned, and part of our work with MCC was preparing a sort of a resource, a learning resource for future sponsors. And some of this is to help connect new sponsors who are new to the sponsorship scene, connect with the history of sponsorship in Canada, MCC's history, and the wealth of knowledge that we have from people who have sponsored refugees for years and years. And so that, I think that it's finding ways to take advantage of what we know and the experience that people have and bring to this.
Thank you. Anyone else want to jump in? We are getting some more questions. Sabine, yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, I just saw a question, and this relates to something I had wanted to say sort of at the end of this, and it relates to something I said earlier about the shift, on the type of communities that are getting organized around sponsoring. So there's a question being asked around what does this look like in the newer, faith communities that are now emerging in that sponsorship space. So Muslim communities, the Eritrean, Ethiopian, communities that are also sponsoring either through their associations or often through their own churches. And so I think this is a really interesting question, and the reason why it is so interesting is because we said earlier that in the early adopter faith communities there were very little direct links between the people in those communities and the refugees. The opposite is true for these new organizations that are emerging in that space, where there's often, almost 100% probably of the members in these organizations themselves have family members that are refugees. So the question is, how do they even make decisions about whom to sponsor? And I think that would be a really interesting piece of research. I know there's researchers out there because we know anecdotally some of the things, how they organize. We know anecdotally some of these communities are paying into funds, on an annual basis, and then they hold almost like a lottery, where they will pull one or two families out of a hat, essentially, and say those are the ones that are being funded and sponsored with the funds this year. But this is all very anecdotal, so I think we don't really know a lot about that, and it would be very interesting to see some research undertaking into this. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you. I see one question about researching government sponsorship. Always, it seems, particularly in these moments, there's less research into government sponsorship. Government sponsorship used to be our predominant way of sponsoring and resettling refugees to this country. And one of my major concerns is always how much that has diminished without putting it in contest with private sponsorship and the wealth of commitment to refugee resettlement that you see through sponsorship. Jeff, I know you want to say something, and then Maddie, and I know we only have 5 minutes left. So I will point to Jeff now and then Maddie.
Yeah, just in the spirit of looking ahead, maybe I'll just make a closing reflection on a methodological point, which is just how we treat religion when we talk about, when we're in the field of migration studies or refugee studies more particularly, that I think, an examination of the historical record and even the contemporary scene reveals like the heavy involvement of religious groups in this field of practice. And I think it's something that a certain, maybe a generation of scholars overlooked, maybe confusing religion with simply private faith or personal faith, only existing at the level of behavior and motivation and belief at the individual level, when in fact religion exerts a profound social force. It is a collective power as well. And so I think maybe giving more attention, there's a need to give more attention to the role of religion as a social force as well as an individual or personal one. by scholars in this field of study. And I think that's something that our book revealed. And it's also, it's not to oversimplify the role of religion. I think also we don't want to now treat religion or religious groups as simply indistinguishable from the rest of civil society. I think there is something particular or particular characteristics that religious groups have that they share as a kind of category that I think is worth further analysis to better understand why we have ended up with the kind of refugee policies and programs that we have and how they operate today. And I think that's something that came through over the last hour and a half, but I would just make a special appeal that scholars take greater account of that moving forward.
That could also be your next book.
That's right.
Maddie, did you have a comment you wanted to put in?
Sure, and I'll make this quite brief. And Jeff, if you want to collaborate on a civil society religious group research project, you have my contact information. I was just thinking about the question on sort of government sponsorship and Shauna's comment about, when we're looking at either private sponsorship or government sponsored refugee programs, you can't look at them necessarily in isolation. And one of the, sort of lessons I tried to sort of tease out in looking at Operation Ezra is what does private sponsorship and what does government sponsorship programs and initiatives reveal about one another. And I think in the context of Operation Ezra, it revealed some potential shortcomings and some gaps, perhaps, in terms of the resettlement aspect of sponsorship between the two programs, arguably. But also sort of, I think it's important to look at government, not necessarily government sponsorship, but government and the relationship between government itself and private sponsorship groups. And I think sort of the book generally talks about that from different lenses. And the last thing that I will say, because I know we're pretty much at time, is that some sponsorship groups, and I think Operation Ezra is a good example of how I think some of these shared values that have brought these groups together, I think transcends sort of maybe some narrow ideas of what religion means. And it's more of, it's sort of this group in and of itself has become very much an advocacy group, and advocacy and advocating for sponsorship and for refugees has become sort of a central, I think, part of their central identity.
Thank you. I am going to call it here because I know for all of us, time is precious. There are so many ideas in this book. There are so many ideas in these chapters. I got to edit it, but the reason I want you to read it is not because my name's on it, but because there is so much wealth of information in these chapters that I think anyone who's thinking about sponsorship, and I've been thinking about it for over a decade, and every time I read these chapters, I learn new things and think about the program a little bit differently. So thank you to my panelists for giving your time today. I know we all have busy and strange schedules at the moment. Thank you to Sean and Michelle and the Center for Refugee Studies for hosting it. And thank you to all of those who stuck with us for this hour and a half to learn and think a bit. With that, Sean, I guess I'll hand it back to you.
Thanks so much, Shauna, and thanks to all the panelists today for what I think was a really interesting and thought-provoking discussion. I mentioned that I just got the book yesterday, so I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but today's discussion has definitely kind of bumped it up on my reading list. So I'm looking forward to getting to it soon, and I'm sure that's true for many people in the audience. So thanks to the panelists, and thanks to the audience for being here.
Thank you.